The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of money and lilies. It was a suffocating combination, the cloying sweetness of the flowers mingling with the crisp, metallic tang of wealth that seemed to seep from the very walls of my father's mansion. I stood near the back, a ghost at my own family's feast, watching the spectacle unfold. Crystal chandeliers, each one costing more than my car, dripped light onto the polished marble floors, making the room glitter like a diamond cave. A string quartet played softly in the corner, a gentle, elegant sound completely at odds with the frantic, clawing ambition that defined everyone in this room. My father, Richard Ashford, stood at the center of it all, a king in his custom-tailored suit. At 70, he still commanded a room without raising his voice. His hair was a distinguished silver, his posture ramrod straight. He was a titan, a man who had built Ashford Industries into a 120 million empire, and tonight was his coronation, or rather, the coronation of his chosen successor, my brother, Ethan. I watched him move through the crowd, a practiced smile plastered on his handsome face. People flocked to him, laughing at his jokes, clapping him on the back. He was 40 years old, but he still had the easy, unearned confidence of a golden boy who had never faced a single consequence in his life. He wore his success like he wore his suit, a perfect fit, tailored by someone else. I knew because I was the one who had done the tailoring. For years, I had been the silent architect of his triumphs, the one who worked through the night to salvage the deals he nearly tanked, the one who rewrote his clumsy proposals into winning pitches. I was the vice president of operations, the engine that made the company run, while he was the shiny hood ornament. My mother, Eleanor, drifted through the room like a pale wraith in a silk gown, her smile as delicate and fragile as a sponge of her flower. She would occasionally catch my eye, a flicker of something, pity, guilt, before her gaze would slide away. She was a master of avoidance, a woman who had long ago chosen the comfort of compliance over the difficulty of confrontation. The clinking of a glass against a microphone brought the room to a hush. My father stood at the podium, beaming. "Tonight," he began, his voice booming with authority, "we celebrate not an ending, but a new beginning. We celebrate the future of Ashford Industries." He spoke of legacy, of strength, of vision. Then his eyes found Ethan in the crowd, and his voice softened with a pride that was a physical blow to my chest. "My son, Ethan," he declared, "has the grit and the brilliance to lead this company into the next generation. He is the future." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And so tonight, I am officially handing him the keys to the kingdom. The company is his. This house is his. The private jet is his. Everything." The room erupted in thunderous applause. People were on their feet, cheering. Ethan's grin widened, and he basked in the spotlight like a sunflower turning to the sun. I felt the air leave my lungs, my body turning to stone in my chair. I had expected this. I had known this was coming. But the reality of it, the public declaration, was a fresh wound. Then my father's eyes, cold as chips of ice, landed on me. The warmth in his voice vanished, replaced by a chilling contempt. The room quieted, sensing the shift, leaning in for the final act of the drama. "And as for my daughter, Gwendolyn," he said, his voice dropping to a low, cruel whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. He paused, savoring the moment, the power he held over me. "You get nothing." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy as shards of glass. A few nervous titters broke the silence. He wasn't finished. "You were never meant to exist," he continued, his lips curling into a sneer. "I wish you had died at birth." For a single horrified heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then it broke. Laughter. It started with Ethan, a loud, barking laugh of pure malice. Then others joined in, a horrifying chorus of chuckles and guffaws. They were laughing at the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of a father publicly disowning his child. My mother simply lowered her head, studying the wine in her glass as if it held the secrets of the universe. The heat rushed to my face, a tidal wave of shame so powerful it made me dizzy, my vision blurred. The glittering room, the smiling faces, they all dissolved into a swirling vortex of mockery. I couldn't breathe. Every cell in my body screamed at me to run, to disappear. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping loudly across the marble, drawing more eyes to my humiliation. I stood and walked toward the exit, each step a monumental effort. The laughter followed me, clinging to my back like a shroud. I was nothing, a mistake, a ghost they were all too happy to see exorcised. My life's work, my sacrifices, my desperate, foolish hope for a crumb of his approval, it all meant nothing. The grand oak doors of the ballroom felt 1,000,000 miles away. My legs were heavy, as if I were wading through concrete. The sound of my father proposing a toast to Ethan, the future CEO, echoed behind me, punctuated by another round of enthusiastic applause. They had already forgotten me. I was a footnote, a brief, unpleasant interruption in an otherwise perfect evening. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, on the intricate patterns of the marble, counting them to keep myself from breaking down completely, one foot in front of the other. Just get to the door. Just get out of here. I could feel the stares, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Look at the poor, pathetic daughter. Look at the girl who gets nothing. Just as my hand reached for the cold brass handle of the door, another hand gently touched my arm. I flinched, pulling back as if I'd been burned. Gwendolyn. The voice was quiet but firm, a calm island in the storm of my humiliation. I looked up and saw my great-uncle Arthur Vance. He was my grandfather's cousin, a quiet, stoic man who had been the family's lawyer for 50 years. His eyes, nested in a web of wrinkles, were filled with a gravity that cut through my haze of pain. Unlike my father, Arthur had never treated me with contempt. He had always looked at me with a quiet, appraising respect that I never understood. "Don't leave just yet," he murmured, his voice low enough so that no one else could hear. Not like this. "There's nothing left for me here, Uncle Arthur," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You heard him." "I heard a fool," he corrected me gently, "a loud, arrogant fool, but his words are not the final say." He reached into the inside pocket of his tweed jacket and pulled out a long, cream-colored envelope. It was thick and heavy, yellowed with age, and sealed with a dark blue wax emblem I recognized immediately. It was my grandfather's seal, the Ashford family crest. "Your grandfather, William, entrusted this to me a long time ago," Arthur said, pressing the envelope into my trembling hand. "He made me promise to give it to you on the day your father retired. He said you would know when the time was right to open it." I stared down at the envelope. My name, Gwendolyn Ashford, was written across the front in my grandfather's elegant looping script. My grandfather had passed away over a decade ago. He was the founder of Ashford Industries, the true architect of our family's fortune. He had been a stern but fair man, and in the haze of my childhood memories, I remembered him being the only one who ever truly saw me. He'd listen to my ideas, praise my schoolwork, and tell me I had a mind for business, sharper than your father's. My father had always dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man. "What is this?" I asked, my fingers tracing the raised wax seal. It's the truth, Arthur said simply. His gaze was intense. Your grandfather was a man who planned for every contingency, Gwendolyn, especially the failings of his own son. He squeezed my shoulder gently. Go home, read it, then we'll talk. Without another word, he turned and melted back into the crowd, leaving me standing at the edge of the ballroom, the heavy envelope a tangible weight in my hand. It felt like a lifeline, a mystery, a weapon. I didn't know what it was, but for the first time that night, a flicker of something other than pure, agonizing shame sparked within me. Clutching the envelope to my chest, I pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the cold night air. I didn't run. I walked away with the last shred of my dignity, the laughter from the party finally fading behind me, replaced by the pounding of my own heart. Thank you for being here with me. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. Your presence means the world to me. My apartment was my sanctuary, a quiet, orderly space high above the city, filled with books and soft light. It was a world away from the suffocating grandeur of my father's mansion. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, the clatter echoing in the silence. My hands were still shaking. I placed the mysterious envelope on my polished kitchen island, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. I couldn't bring myself to open it, not yet. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the storm of my emotions. As the water heated, the memories came, unbidden and sharp as ever. They always did in moments like this, a slideshow of a lifetime spent trying to earn my place. I remembered being 12, so proud of the detailed business plan I'd written for a neighborhood dog walking service. I'd presented it to my father, complete with charts and projected earnings. He'd glanced at it for a moment, then tossed it aside. Cute, Gwendolyn, he'd said, before turning his attention to Ethan, who had just kicked a soccer ball through the living room window. Instead of being angry, my father had laughed and ruffled Ethan's hair. That's my boy, he'd boomed. Powerful leg. I had quietly picked up my crumpled business plan and thrown it away. The memories fast-forwarded. College. I'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration. Ethan had barely scraped by with a communications degree, spending most of his time at fraternity parties. Yet, at graduation, my father had gifted him a brand new BMW. For me, he'd offered a curt, well done, and a handshake. The disparity was so stark, so blatant, it had stolen the air from my lungs. But the sharpest memory, the one that still felt like an open wound, was from 3 years ago, the Chen account. It was a multi-million-dollar contract with an international manufacturing giant, the biggest deal in our company's history. Ethan was in charge of the final negotiations, and he, in his infinite carelessness, had nearly destroyed it. He'd missed a critical deadline, insulted a key executive, and promised deliverables we couldn't possibly meet. I found out at 10 p.m. on a Friday night, thanks to a frantic call from a junior team member. While Ethan was out partying, I had spent the entire weekend, 48 straight hours, without sleep, fueled by caffeine and sheer panic. I'd called every contact I had, pulled every string, and personally drafted a new, viable proposal. I flew to Shanghai on a red-eye flight on Monday morning, met with Mr. Chen myself, apologized profusely for the misunderstanding, and walked him through my new plan. I saved the deal. I saved the company from a catastrophic failure. I flew home exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time, I thought, he'll have to see me. He'll have to acknowledge what I did. At the next board meeting, my father stood up. I want to commend my son, Ethan, he announced, his chest puffed out with pride. He faced a challenging situation with the Chen account and navigated it with remarkable skill. He has truly come into his own as a leader. I sat there, frozen. I watched as Ethan stood up, a modest smile on his face, and accepted the congratulations. He never once looked at me. My father never mentioned my name. It was as if I hadn't existed. I had been erased from my own victory. After the meeting, I confronted my mother. "Why did you let him do that?" I'd pleaded, my voice raw. "You knew what I did." Eleanor had patted my hand, her expression one of weary resignation. "Oh, Gwendolyn," she'd sighed, "don't make waves. It's important for your brother's confidence. Just be a team player. Do it for the family, dear." For the family. That was always the excuse. For the family, I was to be the silent workhorse, the invisible fixer. For the family, Ethan was to be the star. For the family, I was to be nothing. The kettle whistled, a shrill scream that snapped me back to the present. I poured the boiling water over the tea bag, my hand steady now. The memories didn't bring tears anymore. They brought a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't new. Tonight wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being treated like I was nothing more than a serviceable but ultimately disposable tool. I sat on my sofa, the warm mug of tea a small comfort in my cold hands. The city lights twinkled outside my window, a galaxy of distant, indifferent stars. For a long time, I just sat there, letting the silence of my apartment wash over me, trying to scrub away the filth of the evening's humiliation. My mind was a maelstrom of anger and hurt, but underneath it all, a strange and terrifying calm was beginning to settle. It was the calm of acceptance. The acceptance that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked or how much I achieved, I would never be enough for them. The thought was both devastating and, in a strange way, liberating. If I could never win their love or respect, then I could stop trying. I could stop contorting myself into the shape of the daughter they wanted and just be. But who was I without that desperate, lifelong quest for their approval? My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a violent intrusion into the quiet. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID read, "Mother." A flicker of foolish hope ignited in my chest. Maybe she was calling to apologize. Maybe, away from my father's domineering presence, she had found her conscience. Maybe she was calling to say she was sorry, that she loved me, that what my father did was wrong. I swiped to answer, my voice small. "Hello?" "Gwendolyn." Her voice was not warm or apologetic. It was thin and brittle, laced with an unmistakable edge of accusation. "I cannot believe what you did tonight." I was so stunned I couldn't speak. What I did? To just stand up and walk out like that? She continued, her voice rising with a rehearsed-sounding indignation. "You created such a scene. You completely ruined your father's big moment. He is so disappointed in you. Do you have any idea how you made him look?" The hope in my chest died, turning instantly to ice. It spread through my veins, chilling me to the bone. He had just publicly wished me dead, and she was scolding me for my exit. He said he wished I had never been born, I managed to choke out, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Oh, you're being so dramatic," she scoffed. "You know how your father is. He has a flair for the theatrical. You're supposed to be the tough one. You can't take a little joke?" A joke. She called it a joke. That was it. That was the moment. The snap. It wasn't a loud, explosive break. It was a quiet, cold, and final severance. The last thread of hope, of filial duty, of childish longing for a mother's protection just dissolved. In its place was a clarity so sharp and bright it was almost painful. I saw her then, not as my mother, but as his enabler. The silent partner in my lifelong degradation. The one who smoothed things over, who told me to be quiet, who sacrificed my well-being on the altar of her own comfortable, conflict-free existence. She wasn't weak, she was complicit. My voice, when I finally spoke, was devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a stranger. I have to go, Eleanor. I used her first name. I had never done that before in my entire life. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Gwendolyn, don't you dare take that tone with... I ended the call. I placed the phone back on the table with a steady hand. The shaking had stopped. The storm inside me had ceased. There was only a vast, empty, and eerily peaceful calm. I was done. Done crying, done hoping, done trying. My gaze fell upon the envelope on the kitchen island. It no longer looked like a snake or a time bomb. It looked like a key. With deliberate, unhurried steps, I walked over to it. My fingers were steady as I broke the old wax seal. The tearing of the paper was the only sound in the quiet apartment. It sounded like the beginning of everything. The paper inside the envelope was thick and creamy, a heavy vellum that felt important to the touch. There were 2 documents. The first was a folded letter, and the second was a thicker sheaf of legal papers, bound with a blue ribbon. I unfolded the letter first. The ink was slightly faded, but the handwriting was just as I remembered it. My grandfather William's bold, decisive script. I took a deep breath and began to read. My dearest Gwendolyn, if you are reading this, then I have been gone for some time, and the day has come that I both hoped for and dreaded. The day your father steps down from the company I built. I am a man of business, my dear, not a man of sentiment, but you were always the grandchild who saw the world not just for what it was, but for what it could be. You have my mind, but more importantly, you have your grandmother's heart. It is a formidable combination. I have watched you grow. I saw the spark in you from the very beginning. While your brother was content to play with the toys I gave him, you were the one who wanted to know how they were made. While your father saw strength only in bluster and volume, you cultivated a quiet, formidable intelligence. He has never been able to see you, Gwendolyn. His pride and his foolish preference for a male heir have blinded him to the fact that the greatest asset Ashford Industries has is not its portfolio or its real estate, but you. I am not a fool. I know my son. Richard is a good manager, but a poor leader. He is driven by ego, not by vision. And he has raised your brother to be his mirror image, but without any of the substance. Ethan is weak, and he will run this company into the ground, propped up by your father's legacy and your own silent, thankless labor. I will not allow the work of my life to be squandered by the arrogance of one man and the incompetence of another. Legacy, my dear girl, is not about bloodline. It is about character. It is about entrusting the future to the hands most capable of building it. That is why I have made the arrangements that you will find in the accompanying document. Do not let them bully you. Do not let them diminish you. Your father's words are wind. The law is stone. I am giving you this power not as a gift, but as a responsibility. Do not let cruelty define your leadership, as it has defined your father's. The empire I built was meant to lift people up, not to crush them. I give it to you, Gwendolyn, because you have compassion. Do not squander it. Prove me right. With all my belief in you. William Ashford. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face, but they were not tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of validation, of a profound, soul-deep gratitude. He had seen me. All along, he had seen me. The one person whose respect I had valued above all others had not only seen my worth, but he had also bet his entire legacy on it. He had left me a shield and a sword. My hands, now trembling again, but with adrenaline, not fear, reached for the second document. I untied the blue ribbon. The title at the top was clear and unambiguous. Last Will and Testament of William H. Ashford, Addendum regarding corporate governance of Ashford Industries, Inc. I was not a lawyer, but the language was starkly clear, drafted with an ironclad precision that left no room for misinterpretation. It stipulated that upon William's death, his controlling shares in the company, a full 60%, were to be placed in a trust, managed by Arthur Vance. My father, Richard, was granted the title of CEO and the right to run the company for the duration of his professional life. However, the document stated, in no uncertain terms, that the moment Richard Ashford officially retired, resigned, or was otherwise incapacitated, the trust would be dissolved, and the entirety of William Ashford's 60% controlling interest in the company was to be transferred immediately and irrevocably to one person, me, Gwendolyn Ashford. I read the clause again and again. 60% controlling interest, not to my father, not to my brother, to me. It wasn't just an inheritance, it was a coup, a silent, patient, brilliantly executed coup, planned more than a decade in advance by a man who knew his son's character all too well. My father had spent the evening crowing about handing Ethan the keys to the kingdom, but he had never actually held the keys. He had just been the caretaker, and his reign was now officially over. A laugh escaped my lips. It started as a small, choked sound, then grew into a full-blown, teary, triumphant laugh. They thought they had broken me tonight. They had no idea they had just handed me my crown. The sun rose over the city, casting long shadows across my living room floor. I hadn't slept. The night was a blur of adrenaline, tears, and a dawning, steely resolve. The letter and the will lay on my coffee table, not as paper, but as a declaration of war, a war my grandfather had armed me for. I knew my father and Ethan. They would not go down quietly. They would fight this. They would call the will a fraud, claim my grandfather was senile, and try to paint me as a hysterical, grasping woman. Richard's ego was a monstrous thing. He would sooner burn the company to the ground than admit he had been outmaneuvered by his own father and the daughter he despised. A legal document was a powerful weapon, but I needed an arsenal. I needed undeniable, irrefutable proof, not just of my right to lead, but of their unfitness to. My mind, honed by years of strategic planning and crisis management, kicked into high gear. The grief and shock were packed away into a neat little box in the back of my mind. Now was the time for logic, for strategy, for receipts. At 7 a.m. sharp, I made my first call, not to Arthur, but to my executive assistant, Maria Rodriguez. Maria was young, whip-smart, and fiercely loyal. She had been with me for 5 years and had a front-row seat to the daily injustices of the Ashford family dynamic. She'd seen me rewrite Ethan's reports at midnight and then watched him take the credit the next morning. She knew who really ran the company. "Maria," I said when she answered, my voice calm and even, "I need your help with a sensitive project. It requires absolute discretion. Can you come to my apartment instead of the office this morning?" "Of course, Gwen," she said, no questions asked. I knew I could count on her. When she arrived an hour later, I laid it all out. I showed her the letter, The will. Her eyes went wide, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. "It's about time," she whispered. For the next week, my apartment became our war room. We worked with a methodical, relentless focus. We weren't looking for a smoking gun. We were building a fortress of facts, brick by painstaking brick. First, the financials. Maria, a genius with spreadsheets, helped me pull years of internal performance data. We created charts and graphs that told a story in stark, undeniable numbers. Divisions managed by me showed consistent growth, profitability, and innovation. Divisions managed by Ethan showed a terrifying pattern of losses, budget overruns, and failed initiatives, often masked by financial shuffling that I now realized our CFO, Frank Miller, must have helped orchestrate. Then came the emails. My greatest strength had always been my meticulous, almost obsessive record-keeping. My father had once mocked it, calling me a glorified secretary. Now that habit was about to become his undoing. I had saved everything. We printed out hundreds of emails where I had warned my father, in detailed, respectful terms, that Ethan's proposed acquisition of a failing tech startup was a catastrophic mistake. He went ahead with it. The company lost over $8 million. Emails where I had laid out a step-by-step recovery plan for the European sales division after Ethan's mismanagement nearly collapsed it. He implemented my plan without credit and was later praised for his turnaround artistry. Emails with attached reports, presentations, and market analyses, all authored by me, all later presented by Ethan as his own work. We compiled a binder for every major project over the past decade. On one side, Ethan's initial, often disastrous proposals. On the other, my detailed problem-solving interventions. It was a damning chronicle of his incompetence and my invisible labor. Finally, I delved into my personal finances. It was the most painful part. I gathered the bank statements and wire transfer confirmations. The $50,000 I'd loaned Ethan to cover his gambling debts. The $100,000 I'd paid to settle a lawsuit from a former girlfriend he'd harassed. The countless times I'd covered his extravagant restaurant bills or last-minute first-class flights, all under the guise of helping him maintain the family image, as my mother had so delicately put it. He wasn't just my brother. He was a financial parasite, and I had the receipts to prove it. By the end of the week, my dining table was covered in neat stacks of binders, each one labeled and indexed. It was a library of my oppression, a testament to my silent contributions and their brazen exploitation. Looking at it all, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt an immense, chilling power. They had built their kingdom on my back. Now, I was going to use the weight of that kingdom to bring them down. While I was building my arsenal, a different kind of drama was unfolding within the enemy camp. Ethan's fiancée, Tiffany Hayes, was not what she seemed. On the surface, she was the perfect trophy, tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, with a smile that could sell ice in a blizzard. She had latched onto Ethan, drawn to the power and prestige of the Ashford name. But Tiffany was a survivor. She'd grown up with nothing, and her pretty face masked a sharp, observant mind and a core of pragmatism. She saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, and she was beginning to suspect she had hitched her wagon to a liability. She had been at the retirement party, of course, seated at the head table. She had witnessed my public humiliation, and while she had smiled and clapped along with everyone else, inside a small, cold alarm bell had started to ring. It wasn't pity for me that moved her. It was a calculated assessment of the family's character. A man who could speak to his own daughter that way in public was capable of any kind of cruelty. In the days following the party, the Ashford mansion was thick with a toxic, celebratory arrogance. Ethan was insufferable, strutting around like he had personally conquered Rome. My father was in a state of smug self-satisfaction, and Tiffany was there, a silent observer, watching and listening. One evening, she was in the upstairs sitting room, pretending to read a magazine, when Ethan and my father came in, drinks in hand, their voices loud and self-congratulatory. They didn't bother to lower them. They assumed she was just a pretty decoration, incapable of understanding their high-level business talk. "That was a masterstroke, Dad," Ethan slurred, sloshing his whiskey. "Putting Gwendolyn in her place like that. Should have done it years ago. The look on her face, priceless." My father chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. She needed to be reminded of her station. She was getting too big for her britches, with all her reports and analyses. Thinks because she can run a spreadsheet, she can run an empire. Women are for details, not decisions. Tiffany felt a muscle in her jaw tighten. She had built her own small online boutique from scratch. She knew more about e-commerce and marketing than Ethan would ever learn. "Now that she's out of the picture, we can finally have some fun," Ethan continued, his voice greasy with greed. "That ridiculous renewable energy project she was so passionate about, I'm killing it first thing. We're going to use that capital to buy the new Gulfstream jet, and I've got my eye on a yacht, a big one." "All in good time, son," my father said. "First, we have to deal with the legal formalities of the transition. Miller is already drawing up Gwendolyn's severance package, a paltry sum, just enough to keep her from suing for wrongful termination." He took a sip of his drink. "She's been a useful workhorse, I'll give her that. A good little cash cow for the family, but her time is up." Cash cow. The phrase hung in the air. That's what they saw me as. And, Tiffany realized with a jolt of ice-cold clarity, that's what they would see her as too, once the ring was on her finger. A decorative asset, a pretty thing to be seen and not heard. Something inside her snapped. She wasn't like me. She wasn't raised to seek their approval. She was a pragmatist. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that tying her future to these two arrogant, misogynistic fools was a losing proposition. They would use her up and discard her, just as they had done to me. Quietly, she reached for her phone. She tapped the screen, opening the voice memo app. She pressed the red button. And she continued to pretend to read her magazine, listening as my father and brother, in their hubris, happily confessed their plans to misuse company funds and detailed their contempt for the woman who had built the very fortune they were celebrating. She was no longer just an observer. She was gathering intelligence. A week after the party, the summons went out, not from my father, but from Arthur Vance, acting on my behalf. He had invoked a little-known clause in the corporate bylaws that allowed a significant shareholder, which, as the beneficiary of my grandfather's trust, I technically was, to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors. The air in the boardroom on the top floor of the Ashford Industries building was frigid. It wasn't just the air conditioning. It was a palpable tension that clung to the long mahogany table like a shroud. The 5 board members, all men in their late 60s who had been my father's cronies for decades, sat with expressions of weary annoyance. They saw this as a family squabble, a bit of melodrama initiated by a disgruntled daughter. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of imperial displeasure. He looked at me as if I were a bug he was about to squash. Ethan sat beside him, smirking, radiating an aura of smug victory. He kept catching my eye and giving me a little wink, as if we were sharing a private joke. My mother, Eleanor, was also there, seated slightly behind her husband. She had insisted on attending to provide moral support. She sat perfectly still, a statue of wounded matriarchal grace, her eyes fixed on her folded hands. I sat opposite them, with Arthur Vance by my side. I had my laptop in front of me and a single slim binder. I felt strangely calm. The terror and humiliation of the party had been burned away, leaving only the cold, hard certainty of my purpose. My father began the meeting without preamble, his voice dripping with condescension. "I believe we all know why we're here," he said, gesturing dismissively in my direction. "My daughter, Gwendolyn, has apparently had some difficulty accepting the recent transition of leadership. It's an emotional time, and we're all prepared to make allowances. However, her actions have necessitated this formal meeting." He slid a stack of papers across the table. "This is a proposal drafted by our CFO, Frank Miller, and myself to officially remove Gwendolyn from her position as Vice President of Operations and from the board itself, effective immediately. We feel it's in the best interest of the company to have a clean break." Ethan leaned forward, his expression a caricature of concern. "We're worried about you, Gwen," he said, his voice oozing fake sympathy. "You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe some time off, away from the pressures of the business, would do you good." It was a classic gaslighting maneuver. Paint me as unstable, emotional, and unfit. The board members nodded along, their faces sympathetic but firm. They were ready to rubber stamp my execution. They thought this would be a quick, clean affair. I let the silence stretch for a moment, meeting each of their gazes one by one. I let them see the woman they thought they were dismissing. Not hysterical, not emotional. Calm, composed, ready. "Thank you, Father," I said, my voice even and clear, cutting through the thick tension. "Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate your concern for my well-being." I looked around the table at the board members. "Gentlemen, my father is correct. We are here to discuss a transition of leadership, but it's not the one he thinks it is." Arthur Vance cleared his throat. "Before we proceed with any votes," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "there is a legal matter of corporate governance that must be addressed first. It concerns the last will and testament of the founder of this company, William H. Ashford." Richard's confident expression faltered for the first time. A flicker of confusion, of annoyance, crossed his face. He had no idea what was coming. The trap was set. My father stared at Arthur, his jaw tight. "William's will? What does that have to do with anything? That was settled years ago. This is a pathetic, desperate stalling tactic." He waved a dismissive hand. "Frank, please, continue with the presentation on Gwendolyn's performance review." Frank Miller, our portly, sycophantic CFO, cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. He was a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for, and my father had been paying his salary for 30 years. He peered at me over his spectacles with an expression of manufactured regret. "As the CEO has stated," Frank began, his voice a droning monotone, "this is a difficult but necessary step. Over the past 18 months, we have seen a marked decline in Gwendolyn's engagement. She has become disruptive. Her recent focus on a high-risk renewable energy initiative, for example, represents a reckless departure from our company's core competencies and a potential drain on shareholder value." He was talking about the project I had poured my heart and soul into for the last year, the one that was projected to not only be highly profitable within 5 years, but also make our company a leader in sustainable manufacturing. It was my vision for the future of Ashford Industries, and they were painting it as the ramblings of a madwoman. "Furthermore," Frank droned on, "we have received informal complaints from key partners about her abrasive management style. There is a concern that her approach is damaging long-standing business relationships. This was a bald-faced lie. My strongest asset was my relationship with our clients. I knew them, their families, their needs. Ethan was the one who couldn't remember a name and thought yelling was a negotiation tactic. Ethan chimed in, laying the sympathy on thick. "It's true," he said, shaking his head sadly. "I had to personally smooth things over with our German distributor last month. He felt Gwen was being inflexible. It was a delicate situation." I remembered that situation. Inflexible meant I had refused to approve a shipment of faulty parts that would have violated 3 international safety regulations, a corner Ethan wanted to cut to meet a deadline he had missed. I had protected the company from a massive lawsuit, and he was twisting it into a failure on my part. Then came my mother's contribution, the final theatrical twist of the knife. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her voice trembling slightly. "As a mother," she began, her gaze sweeping across the sympathetic faces of the board members, "my heart is broken. To see my daughter so lost, so angry. We only want what's best for her. Perhaps this rigorous corporate environment is simply not the right fit for her temperament. We are prepared to offer a generous severance package, of course, to help her find her way." It was a masterful performance. They had built a perfect self-contained narrative. I was the unstable, emotional daughter, lashing out because I couldn't handle the pressure, a liability to the company's future. They were the concerned father, the supportive brother, the heartbroken mother, forced to make a tough decision for the greater good. It was airtight. It was convincing. And it was all a complete and utter fabrication. The chairman of the board, a man named George Peterson, looked at me with an expression of finality. "Gwendolyn, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations?" He was just going through the motions. The decision had already been made. They were all in my father's pocket. They were ready to vote me into oblivion. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I looked at my father, my brother, my mother. I saw the triumphant gleam in their eyes. They thought they had won. They thought the story was over. "Yes, George," I said, my voice ringing with a calm clarity that startled them. I turned to my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Let's begin with the renewable energy project." "Frank, you called it a potential drain on shareholder value. I believe this presentation might offer a different perspective." I hit the enter key. The large screen at the end of the boardroom flickered to life. Before I could start my presentation, Arthur Vance held up a hand. His presence, so quiet until now, suddenly filled the room with an undeniable gravitas. "Before Gwendolyn is forced to defend herself against these baseless accusations," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, "I must insist on clarifying the legal framework under which this meeting is actually operating. The matter of William Ashford's will is not a stalling tactic, Richard. It is the very foundation of this company's ownership." He opened his briefcase and produced a thick, leather-bound document. It was the original will, its pages brittle with age. He also produced a second, more modern document. "This," he said, holding up the old will, "is the will you are all familiar with. It appointed Richard as CEO. However, William, being a prudent man, also created a legally binding addendum concerning the transfer of his controlling shares, which were placed in a trust. This," he said, holding up the second document, "is that addendum, notarized, witnessed, and filed with the state of New York over a decade ago. It has been under seal at my law firm with explicit instructions to be opened and executed upon Richard Ashford's official retirement." He let his words sink in. My father's face, which had been a mask of arrogant dismissal, began to tighten. A flicker of uncertainty appeared in his eyes. "As you all heard at the party last week," Arthur continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, "Richard publicly and officially declared his retirement. That declaration, witnessed by over 200 people, was the legal trigger for this addendum to take effect." He opened the addendum and laid it flat on the table. "I will not bore you with all the legal jargon. I will simply read the single operative clause." He cleared his throat and read, his voice clear and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "Upon the event of my son, Richard H. Ashford's retirement, resignation, or death, the Ashford Family Trust shall be immediately dissolved, and my entire controlling interest of 60% of the common stock of Ashford Industries, Inc. shall be transferred in its entirety and without encumbrance to my granddaughter, Gwendolyn Eleanor Ashford." A deep, profound, and utterly shocked silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. The board members stared, their mouths slightly agape. Ethan looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his face a comical mask of disbelief. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her carefully constructed composure shattering. And my father's face drained of all color. He went from a healthy, florid complexion to a ghastly, pasty white in a matter of seconds. He stared at Arthur, then at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. He had just spent a week celebrating a kingdom he had never owned. He had publicly disowned and humiliated the one person who now held the fate of his entire world in her hands. That's impossible," he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's a forgery. It has to be." "I assure you, Richard, it is not," Arthur said coolly. "My firm's reputation stands behind its authenticity. William wanted to ensure his life's work would pass to the most capable hands. He simply didn't trust yours to be the final judge of that." The blow was devastating, and it landed right on my father's most vulnerable point, his pride. The idea that his own father had deemed him unworthy, had gone behind his back to subvert his authority, was an insult he could not process. Ethan finally found his voice. "This is insane. You can't just hand the company over to her." "I'm the heir. Everyone knows that." "The law, Mr. Ashford, does not operate on what everyone knows," Arthur replied without missing a beat. "It operates on legally binding documents like this one. As of last Saturday night, Gwendolyn is the majority shareholder of this company. Therefore, she cannot be removed from this board. In fact," he added with a slight, almost imperceptible smile, "she is the one who now chairs this meeting." All eyes turned to me. The power in the room had shifted so suddenly, so completely, it was like the reversal of gravity. I was no longer the defendant. I was the judge. My father slammed his fist on the mahogany table, the sound cracking through the stunned silence. "I will fight this. I will tie this up in court for years. This is my company." "I built it." "You managed it, Father," I corrected him, my voice steady. The fear was gone. The years of intimidation had evaporated, leaving behind a core of cold, hard steel. Grandfather built it, and he saw fit to leave it to me. But since you've raised the question of fitness to lead, let's address it. I clicked a key on my laptop. The screen behind me lit up with the first slide of my presentation. It was a simple line graph showing the company's overall profitability over the last 10 years. "As you can see," I began, my voice crisp and professional, "the company has seen modest but stagnant growth. Now let's break that down by division." Click. The screen changed to two separate graphs, side by side. One, labeled Divisions Managed by G. Ashford, showed a steep upward trajectory. The other, labeled Divisions Managed by E. Ashford, showed a jagged, terrifying plunge into the red. The divisions under my direct management, I explained, including international logistics, product development, and corporate sales, have seen an average of 14% year-over-year growth. The divisions under Ethan's management, domestic marketing, new acquisitions, and strategic partnerships, have collectively lost this company over $22 million in the last 5 years alone. Frank Miller started to sputter. Now, that data is taken out of context. Click. The next slide appeared. It was the email I had sent to my father and Frank warning them about the disastrous acquisition of the tech startup, Innovate. My email was on the left. On the right was the final report, showing an $8 million write-off. Click. An email chain detailing Ethan's bungling of the German distributor account. My follow-up emails showing how I had personally negotiated a new agreement and salvaged the relationship were highlighted. Click, click, click. For the next 10 minutes, I walked them through it, a relentless, factual, and utterly damning presentation. Failed projects, missed deadlines, budget overruns. Each failure was documented, time-stamped, and proven to be Ethan's responsibility. And each time, my intervention, also documented, was shown to be the solution. The binders on the table in front of me were just the hard copies. I had it all. The board members, who had been ready to dismiss me minutes earlier, were now sitting bolt upright, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They were businessmen. They understood numbers, and the numbers told an undeniable story of incompetence and sabotage, covered up by nepotism. Ethan's face was beet red. "She's twisting things. It's not that simple." "Isn't it?" I asked calmly. "Then perhaps a third party can offer some clarity." I clicked one last time. My laptop's camera activated, and a live video feed appeared on the screen. It was the face of Mr. Chen, the CEO of our largest international partner, calling in from his office in Shanghai. "Mr. Chen," I said, "thank you for joining us. Could you tell the board who you consider to be your primary and trusted partner at Ashford Industries?" Mr. Chen, a powerful and no-nonsense man, smiled warmly at my image. "Gwendolyn," he said, his voice clear, "it is always a pleasure. To answer your question, gentlemen, I do business with Ashford Industries for one reason: Gwendolyn Ashford. Her integrity and her brilliance are the only reasons this partnership exists. I was, in fact, about to terminate our $50 million contract due to her brother's unprofessionalism until she personally intervened. Let me be perfectly clear. If she is not leading this company, then we are no longer partners. Good day." The video feed cut out. The silence that followed was absolute. I had just demonstrated, with irrefutable proof, that I was the sole reason the company was still afloat. I had not only the legal right to lead, but the moral and professional right as well. I had saved the receipts, and I had just cashed them all in. Thank you for staying with me until this moment. You are a patient and wonderful person. Please like this video and comment the number 1 below so I know you've journeyed with me this far. Your support is an incredible encouragement for me. Comment 1 now and listen to how my story continues. My father stared at the blank screen where Mr. Chen's face had been, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The bedrock of his world had crumbled to dust beneath him. His narrative of my incompetence was in tatters, exposed as a self-serving lie. Ethan, however, was not so easily silenced. Rage and entitlement warred on his face. "This is a setup, a trick. She's been plotting this all along. Dad, tell them." But my father had no words. He looked old, suddenly. The titan of industry had shrunk into a confused, cornered old man. Just as Ethan was about to launch into another tirade, the boardroom door opened. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Tiffany Hayes, Ethan's fiancée. She was dressed in a sharp navy blue dress, her expression unreadable. "Tiffany?" Ethan stammered. "What are you doing here?" "I believe this meeting concerns the future of the company," she said, her voice cool and steady. "And I have some information that might be relevant to that future." She walked into the room, not with the demure steps of a future socialite, but with the purposeful stride of a woman on a mission. She held her phone in her hand. "You've all heard Gwendolyn's side of the story, backed up by facts and figures," Tiffany said, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the board. "Now, I think you should hear Richard and Ethan's side, in their own words." A sense of dread, thick and suffocating, descended on my father and brother. My mother, Eleanor, looked at Tiffany with pure, unadulterated panic. Tiffany tapped her phone and placed it on the polished mahogany table. A voice filled the silent room. It was Ethan's, slurring slightly, arrogant and loud. "Putting Gwendolyn in her place like that. Should have done it years ago. The look on her face, priceless." A low chuckle, my father's voice. "She needed to be reminded of her station. Thinks because she can run a spreadsheet, she can run an empire. Women are for details, not decisions." A gasp went through the room. One of the board members, a man who had 2 daughters of his own, flushed with anger. The recording continued. Ethan's voice again. "Now that she's out of the picture, we can finally have some fun. That ridiculous renewable energy project she was so passionate about, I'm killing it first thing. We're going to use that capital to buy the new Gulfstream jet." My father's voice complicit. "All in good time, son. Miller is already drawing up Gwendolyn's severance package." "A paltry sum. She's been a useful workhorse, I'll give her that. A good little cash cow for the family, but her time is up." Cash cow. The words echoed in the tomb-like silence of the boardroom. It wasn't just a betrayal of me. It was a confession of their intent to defraud the company, to misuse corporate funds for their own lavish toys. It was a confession of their deep-seated contempt for women. It was a confession of everything. Frank Miller, the CFO, looked like he was about to be physically ill. His career was flashing before his eyes. Tiffany let the recording play for another 30 seconds, which included Ethan bragging about how he'd get Frank to cook the books to hide the cost of the yacht before she stopped it. She looked directly at Ethan, her eyes filled not with love, but with a chilling pity. "For the record, Ethan," she said, her voice cutting through the air, "we're done." She slid the diamond engagement ring off her finger and placed it on the table next to her phone with a soft click. It sounded like a gavel. That was the final, fatal blow. The irrefutable proof, not from me, the disgruntled daughter, but from an impartial and now former insider. It laid bare their characters, their greed, their corruption. There was nowhere left for them to hide. They were exposed utterly and completely in front of the very people they had spent their lives trying to impress. The aftermath of the recording was not loud or explosive. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that follows a detonation. The board members stared at my father and brother, their expressions a mixture of disgust, betrayal, and cold, hard fury. These men were capitalists, yes, but they were not fools. They had been lied to, manipulated, and were moments away from sanctioning the destruction of the very company they were sworn to protect. George Peterson, the chairman, was the first to speak. He looked at my father, his old friend, and there was no trace of camaraderie left in his eyes, only contempt. "Richard," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you have made a mockery of this board, this company, and your father's legacy. You are a disgrace." He then turned to the rest of the board. "I call for a vote. All in favor of accepting the legal transfer of controlling shares to Miss Gwendolyn Ashford and appointing her as the new Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately?" Every hand in the room, except for my father's and Ethan's, shot into the air. "And all in favor of a full, independent audit of the company's finances for the last 10 years, with a particular focus on the divisions managed by Ethan Ashford and the expenditures approved by Richard Ashford." Again, a unanimous show of hands. Frank Miller sank lower in his chair, his face the color of ash. "Finally," George said, his voice like granite, "all in favor of demanding the immediate resignation of Richard Ashford and Ethan Ashford from all positions within this company." Unanimous. It was over, just like that. In the space of an hour, their entire world had been dismantled. "You can't do this. I'll sue every single one of you." "Security," George said calmly into the intercom on the table. 2 large security guards entered the room. They moved toward Ethan and my father with a quiet, professional purpose. My father didn't move. He just sat there, staring into the middle distance, a broken man. The Titan had crumbled. All the power, the arrogance, the bluster had been stripped away, leaving only a hollow, defeated shell. As the guards gently but firmly took his arm to help him to his feet, his body sagged. He clutched his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Father!" I cried out, a reflexive jolt of old, familiar concern piercing through my anger. He was having a heart attack. A mild one, the paramedics would later say, brought on by extreme stress. But in that moment, all I saw was my father, vulnerable and collapsing in front of me. My mother, Eleanor, finally moved. She rushed to his side, her face a mask of terror. Not, I suspected, for his health, but for the complete implosion of her comfortable life. As they wheeled my father out on a gurney, with my mother trailing behind them, wringing her hands, Ethan turned to me one last time. His eyes were filled with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful in its intensity. "You'll regret this, Gwendolyn," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You'll run this place into the ground. And I'll be there to watch you burn." Then the second guard escorted him out, still shouting threats and insults. And then there was silence. I stood at the head of the table, the new CEO of Ashford Industries. The war was over. I had won. But as I looked around the empty, silent boardroom, at the shattered remnants of my family, I didn't feel the euphoria I had expected. I just felt a profound, aching emptiness and the heavy, unfamiliar weight of a crown. 6 months. It felt like a lifetime. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of legal battles, financial audits, and corporate restructuring. My father's lawyers, funded by what little personal wealth he had left, made a feeble attempt to contest the will, but Arthur Vance, true to his word, shut them down with ruthless efficiency. The law, as my grandfather had said, was stone. The audit was as bad as I had feared, and worse. It uncovered years of Ethan's financial negligence, covered up by Frank Miller's creative accounting. Ethan was facing not just corporate exile, but serious legal charges for embezzlement and fraud. He had become a pariah, his name a toxic whisper in the social circles he once dominated. My father recovered from his heart attack, but his spirit did not. He refused to see me or speak to me. He and my mother downsized from the mansion to a modest condo in Florida, living a quiet life funded by his personal pension. The Titan was gone, replaced by a bitter old man living in the shadow of what he had lost. My mother tried to call me once. I saw her name flash on the screen and felt a familiar pang of guilt and duty. I let it ring, and then, for the first time in my life, I did something just for myself. I blocked her number. I cut the cord. It was a small act, a tap on a screen, but it felt like a monumental declaration of independence. I didn't burn down the company, as Ethan had predicted. I rebuilt it. The first thing I did was promote Maria Rodriguez to be my new chief of staff. Together, we dismantled the toxic old boys club culture my father had fostered. We promoted talented people based on merit, not connections. We invested heavily in the renewable energy project, and it was already showing signs of becoming the most profitable division in the company's history. We re-established trust with our clients and our employees. Ashford Industries began to thrive, not on fear and ego, but on integrity and innovation. One afternoon, I was sitting in my new office, my grandfather's old office, which I had redecorated with bright colors and modern art, when my new assistant buzzed me. "Ms. Ashford, Tiffany Hayes is here to see you." I smiled. "Send her in." Tiffany had become an unexpected friend. After the boardroom showdown, she had left town for a while, disentangling herself from the wreckage of her life with Ethan. She had used her own savings to start a new, more ambitious online marketing firm, and she was already making a name for herself. She walked in, looking radiant and confident. "Wow," she said, looking around the office. "Big improvement." "It smells less like old cigars and regret in here." I laughed. A real easy laugh. That was the goal. "Tea?" "Always," she said, sinking into one of the comfortable chairs opposite my desk. We sat there for an hour, talking and laughing. We talked about business, about new projects, about the ridiculousness of the men we had both, in our own ways, escaped. There was an easy camaraderie between us, the unspoken bond of two women who had seen the ugly truth behind the gilded facade and had chosen to walk away. "You know," she said, looking at me over the rim of her teacup, "I used to be so jealous of you. I thought you had everything." "I thought you did too," I admitted. She shook her head. "We were both just playing a role in their little drama." I'm just glad we got to write our own final act. As she was leaving, she turned at the door. "By the way," she said with a grin, "I heard Ethan is trying to get a job as a used car salesman. Apparently, his people skills are not translating well." We both burst out laughing. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of survivors, the laugh of women who were finally free. The emptiness I had felt after the battle was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady sense of peace. I was no longer just a daughter or a sister or a vice president. I was Gwendolyn Ashford, CEO, and I was just getting started. The days of chaos and confrontation eventually settled into a new rhythm, a new normal. A normal where my mornings weren't filled with dread, where my work was valued, and where my nights were my own, peaceful and quiet. One evening, long after the last employee had gone home, I found myself walking through the silent halls of the executive floor. I stopped in front of the boardroom. For months, I had avoided it. It held too many ghosts. But tonight, I felt a pull. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The long mahogany table was empty, polished to a mirror shine. This room, once the stage for my greatest humiliation and my ultimate victory, was now just a room. Its power was gone. My gaze was drawn to the far wall, where a large oil-painted portrait hung. It was my grandfather, William Ashford. He was depicted in his prime, with a stern but kind expression, his eyes seeming to hold a spark of intelligence and foresight. It was the only piece of the old decor I had kept. I walked over and stood before it, looking up at the man who had changed my life from beyond the grave. "Hi, Grandpa," I whispered into the quiet room. "I hope I'm making you proud." Of course, the portrait didn't answer, but as I stood there, a profound sense of connection washed over me. I thought about his letter. Legacy is not about bloodline. It is about character. For so long, my identity had been shaped by my family's definition of me. I was the second best, the disappointment, the workhorse, the mistake. Their words had been the bars of my cage, a prison I had unconsciously helped to build by constantly seeking their validation. But my grandfather had given me a different definition. He saw me as capable, intelligent, compassionate. He hadn't given me the company to spite my father. He had entrusted it to me because he believed I would be a worthy steward. He had given me not just an inheritance, but an identity. That night, the night of the party, they thought they were taking everything from me. But what they really did was set me free. By pushing me to the absolute brink, they forced me to find a strength I never knew I had. By showing me the absolute bottom of their cruelty, they severed the ties of obligation that had bound me for so long. My father had spent years telling me I was nothing. My grandfather's letter reminded me that I was always something. And in that reminder, I finally found the courage to claim my own life. So when I tell this story now, I don't tell it as a story of revenge. I tell it as a story of rebirth. It's a story about the quiet power of truth and how it can, in the end, shout down the loudest lies. It's about realizing that your worth is not and can never be determined by the people who refuse to see it. It is an internal flame, and while others can try to snuff it out, they can only succeed if you let them. Thank you for listening to my entire story. I'm truly grateful for you. Please comment the letter A so I know you're different from the rest and have watched this whole video. If you have any feelings to share about the video, please write them down. Continue to click on other videos on the channel to enjoy more of our stories.